Who was George Washington? 1783. After 7 long years of fighting, the war was finally over. American soldiers had beaten the mighty British Army. The 13 colonies were independent now. Remember, American soldiers had beaten the mighty British Army. The 13 colonies were independent now. Ships full of British soldiers sailed back to England. From here on, nobody in America had to obey King George. Nobody had to obey King George. There was going to be a brand new country with 13 United States. And in 1789, when it came time to elect the first president, who was the number one choice? George Washington, of course. The very first president, the number one choice, was George Washington, of course. George Washington had been the top general throughout the war. He was not the kind of general who just gave orders and then watched soldiers do the fighting. He was often in the thick of battle. Yet Washington was never wounded, not once. Besides being brave, he also was smart, loyal, honest, and fair. Everything a leader should be. Would the war have been won without him? Many people didn't think so. It was no surprise that he won the first election for president. But when he learned the news, he was not happy. Oh no, he wasn't happy at all. He loved being back in Virginia at Mount Vernon, his beautiful home. He loved being back in Virginia at Mount Vernon, his beautiful home. He was 57 years old and hoped to spend the rest of his life there with his wife Martha and her 2 youngest grandchildren. As the very first president, so much would be expected of him. And strange as it may seem to us, George Washington worried that he wasn't up to the job. No, the job of president was not at all to his liking. He did not like being president. But many people said they would only support the new government if George Washington were president. And more than anything, he wanted the new government to work. So he said yes and started off to New York, where he would take the oath of office. At every stop along the way, there were parties and parades for him. Just what George did not want. Today, politicians may spend years planning to run for president. Millions of dollars are spent on campaigns. Yet the man who was known as the father of our country felt like a criminal going off to his execution. All he wanted was to stay home and go fox hunting. On the night of February 22nd, 1732, Augustine Washington set a table by candlelight. A family Bible lay open before him. Gus, as everyone called him, was a tobacco farmer in the colony of Virginia. With a pen made from the quill of a turkey, he wrote down the name of his son George, who had been born that very morning. George's mother, Mary, was Gus's second wife. His first wife had died, leaving him with 2 teenage sons. One night, not long before George was born, a bolt of lightning shot down the chimney of the Washington's farmhouse. It killed a woman who was visiting Mary. Mary worried that the lightning was a sign of bad luck. It might mean that there'd be something wrong with her baby. But George was a strong, healthy baby. People said he looked like his mother. He grew into a tall, athletic man who loved to ride horses. He loved to ride horses through the green countryside. In later years, he was known as the best horseman in Virginia. He was known as the best horseman in Virginia. When George was about 7, the family moved to Ferry Farm. He moved to Ferry Farm. It was across the river from Fredericksburg, Virginia. Ferry Farm was across the road from Fredericksburg, Virginia. By this time, George had a younger sister, Betty, and three younger brothers, Samuel, John, and Charles. People said George and Betty looked a lot alike. As a grown woman, she would do funny imitations of her famous brother. There isn't any information about how George and his father got along, but we do know he wasn't close to his mother. Mary Washington was a cold, bossy woman. All George's friends were scared of her. Strangely, she never took pride in her eldest son, not even after he became president. His letters to her would begin, "Honored Madam," instead of "Dear Mother." And he never introduced his wife, Martha, to her. The person he loved best in the world was his kind half-brother, Lawrence. Lawrence was Gus's oldest son. He was 14 years older than George. Lawrence had gone to school in England. He had learned Greek and Latin. He knew how to dress like a gentleman and act like a gentleman. There wasn't enough money to send George off to England. Instead, he was taught at home, probably by his father and Lawrence. George was great at math. George was great at math. Anything with numbers came easily to him. But he was a terrible speller. He was a terrible speller. It embarrassed him all his life. When George was only 11, his father died. From time to time, George was invited for long visits to Mount Vernon. This was the home of Lawrence and his new bride, Anne Fairfax. George loved it there. In 1746, George was asked to move in for good. So in 1746, George moved in with Lawrence and his new bride. In 1746, George was asked to move in for good, and off he went. He probably was happy, too, to get away from his mother. That's the end of chapter 1, that we're going to stop right here. This book is titled Who Was George Washington, written by Roberta Edwards, illustrated by True Kelly. This is our first chapter that we're going over in the book, called Who Was George Washington. Thank you for listening. We'll be back on tomorrow or the day after for chapter number 2. See y'all. Miss y'all. Take care. Bye.